Most stories about some great achievement, they tend to end with the victory, right? The wall gets built, the city is saved, and that's it. But the book of Nehemiah, it asks a much tougher question. What happens after the big project is finished? How do you go from rebuilding a wall to rebuilding a people? Let's get into it.
So the story picks up, and there's this huge, unexpected problem. Nehemiah has pulled off the impossible. The walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt, they're secure, but there's a pretty big catch. Almost nobody actually wants to live there. The great holy city is practically a ghost town.
And that's our first big challenge. How do you populate an entire city? Seriously, how do you convince people to uproot their lives and move into a place that, yeah, it's holy, but it's not exactly a practical spot to make a living? Now, what's really fascinating here is the why. It wasn't about being scared or, some lack of faith. It was just basic economics. People had to be where the work was, out in the fields, planting their crops, tending to their vineyards. A walled city, no matter how safe or sacred, wasn't going to put food on the table. And just to put this into perspective, scholars figure the population of Jerusalem right then was only about 6,000 people. For a capital city, that is tiny. It just shows you this incredible tension between the ideal of a holy city and the day-to-day reality of life. They had the hardware, but they were desperate for the people. And this really gets to the core of the choice that every single family was facing. I mean, think about it. Do you pick the security and the religious importance of living in the capital, or do you pick the practical option, the one that lets you actually provide for your family out in the country? That is a genuinely tough call. So how'd they solve it? Well, it was a whole process. First, the leaders had to lead by example, so they moved in. Then they asked for volunteers, and anyone who stepped up was publicly blessed and honored for their sacrifice. For everyone else, they cast lots, which was kind of like drawing straws to figure out God's will. And 1 out of every 10 families was chosen to move. So those long lists of names you see in the text, they aren't just a boring census. They're basically a roll call for the city's brave new pioneers. Okay, so with the city finally starting to fill up, it was time to make it feel like a real community. And how do you do that? You throw the biggest party Jerusalem had seen in generations, a massive, joyful dedication of the new walls. This wasn't just a ceremony. This was about forging a brand new identity together. This one line from the text just captures the mood perfectly. This was not some quiet, stuffy event. This was a loud, citywide celebration, so full of genuine, raw joy that you could literally hear it for miles. It was a powerful message to everyone around them. Jerusalem is back, and it is alive. And to pull this off, they went all out. They brought in every musician and singer from all the surrounding villages. They performed purification rituals for the people and for the walls themselves. They put together not 1, but 2 massive choirs, complete with trumpets and all sorts of instruments, and offered up huge sacrifices. Now, just picture this scene for a second. These 2 huge choirs are brought up onto the top of the brand new wall. And then they start marching in opposite directions, one led by the scribe Ezra, just singing praises as they circle the entire city. And then they meet up right at the temple. And just so you get a sense of the scale here, archaeologists have actually found parts of this very wall. On average, it was about 8 feet wide, plenty of room for a parade, and in some places, it was up to 40 feet high. This was this incredible, visible symbol of their new strength and unity, a celebration happening right on top of their greatest achievement. But joy and parties were only one part of the solution. After the celebration, Nehemiah actually leaves Jerusalem for a while, and when he gets back, he finds that things are already starting to slide back into chaos. His response this time is swift, it's severe, and it shows a much, much tougher side of his leadership. So he launches 5 major reforms to basically shock the community back into shape. And these weren't small tweaks. They dealt with everything from who could even be a part of the community to how the temple was run to what was happening on the Sabbath. So the first thing Nehemiah finds is just jaw-dropping. The high priest himself, a guy named Eliashib, had given a big storeroom inside the temple complex to Tobiah, who was one of Nehemiah's worst enemies. He had literally moved the opposition into a suite in the house of God. So what does Nehemiah do? Does he form a committee, hold a meeting? No, the text says he was very angry and he personally marches into that room and just starts throwing all of Tobiah's furniture out into the street. Then he has the whole room ritually cleansed. Now that is decisive action. Next up, he finds out that the temple workers, the Levites, are all gone. And why? Because the people had stopped bringing their tithes, the financial offerings that supported them. So the Levites had to go back to their own farms just to survive. Nehemiah's question, why is the house of God forsaken, just cuts right to the heart of it all. He immediately confronts the officials and reorganizes the entire system. He also sees that the Sabbath, the holy day of rest and worship, had pretty much turned into just another market day. So what does he do? He orders the city gates to be locked from Friday evening straight through to Saturday evening. And when merchants tried to get around it by just camping outside, he personally warned them that if they did it again, he would lay hands on them. Yeah, they got the message pretty quick. And this is where Nehemiah's methods get the most extreme. And for us today, honestly, the most disturbing. He found that men were once again marrying foreign women who worshipped other gods, something that had been forbidden for centuries. And his reaction? It was violent. He confronted them, he cursed them, he beat some of them, and he literally pulled out their hair. So after all of this, the building, the celebrating, the intense, harsh reforms, how does the whole book end? Well, not with another big event, but with something way more personal, Nehemiah's final prayer. It's our last look into the heart of this pretty relentless leader. 4 different times in these last chapters, Nehemiah prays this short, really powerful prayer. He isn't asking for rewards on earth or for people to remember his name. He's asking that God, the ultimate judge, would see his work, see why he did it, and just remember him for the good he tried to do for his people and for God's house. So what are we supposed to do with a story like this today? I mean, especially with the violence and the hair pulling? Well, it's absolutely crucial that we understand how to read an ancient text like this one. And this brings us to what might be the single most important takeaway from this whole thing. The Bible is often being descriptive, not prescriptive. It's describing exactly what Nehemiah did. It is not prescribing that leaders today should go around beating their followers. The lesson isn't to copy his exact methods. The lesson is to adopt his passion, to take God's word and the health of the community just as seriously as Nehemiah did. And that really leaves us with a final question to wrestle with. Nehemiah's story forces us to think about the nature of leadership. He was passionate, he was decisive, he was effective, but he was also harsh and at times even violent. It really makes you wonder, when is it right for a leader to be tough? And when does that toughness cross a line?